All right, we'll get started there. First of all, everybody, welcome to the webinar tonight as part of the Active SG Voyager Tennis Academy online program. I hope all the players and parents are enjoying the program as much as you can. Understand it's a difficult period in Singapore with the lockdown. Hopefully, it ends soon for you guys. And so tonight we have a special guest, Dr. Anthony Ross. Welcome to the call, mate.
Good to be here, Ryan.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'm looking forward to our conversation, mate. And yeah, and for those of you who don't know me, my name's Ryan Henry, and I'm going to be the special or the host for tonight's session. So basically, a really similar format to the last couple of weeks. We're going to have Anthony and I are going to have a chat for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then followed by opening it up for questions towards the end. So. Maybe just to start there, we'll go through a little bit about Anthony's background, just so people are aware of it. So Anthony is a former ATP professional player, a top-ranked Australian junior. He got a master's degree in sports psychology, focused his PhD in tennis parenting, which we're going to have a really some interesting conversations around his studies into that. He's been contracted by Tennis Australia in the past as a sports psychologist focusing on tennis, and he's the founder and owner of Mentally Tough Tennis, which is a sports psychology company that's a partner of Voyager in Australia, and he helps most of our high performance athletes develop and become stronger mentally, and help develop psychological skills required to win in tennis, but also win off the court as well there. So, Rossi, do you want to tell me a little bit about your background as a tennis player, mate?
Yeah, sure. So I started playing tennis, grew up in a little town called Billawheeler, a very small town in Outback Australia, actually, and didn't even have a coach in that town. I just used to play against one end of my family home against a brick wall. And then luckily, actually, a coach that ended up coaching world number one, Pat Rafter, lived in my region and started to organise for me to be able to come down to the city in Brisbane, where I live now. Yeah, just played as a junior, loved the game, loved working on improving, and wasn't super talented, I must say, but kept working hard to the point where by the end of my junior years, I was good enough to get a scholarship to go to Pepperdine University, which is in Malibu in California. And played there 4 years, had an awesome experience in college. And then I played professionally for a few years, played doubles professionally for 3 or 4 years after that. Got to travel the world and play a fair few of the big tournaments, got to play Wimbledon, and yeah, just had an awesome life in tennis, basically.
Yeah, nice, mate. And obviously you had a huge amount of experience as a player. I mean, going through college and then onto the pro circuit, you must have played the game for my maths tells me probably at least 20 to 25 years competitively. What part of the game or what made you get interested in the psychology part of tennis?
Yeah, I think I was always I was super competitive, and I recognised the importance of the psych aspects of the game, or mental toughness. Probably two main important points were when I went to college. My first semester, I didn't have a good first semester. I got a bit overwhelmed and carried away in college, and had a poor first year, and our coach retired, and we got a new coach come in. And basically the new coach, his name was Peter Smith, who became one of the most successful college coaches of all time. He basically cut my scholarship in half. I couldn't afford to come back for the full year, so I had to actually come back to Australia for 6 months to be able to afford to go back. And at that point, I started working with Michael Fox, who's a sports psychologist who's done a lot of work in tennis. And that was really helpful. When I went back to college, I was a lot better prepared and skilled through the work I'd done with Michael, and became a lot more successful. And so I basically recognized through my own playing experience of how important the mental components were. And then the second important experience was when I finished playing, I became a coach initially. And I was coaching a couple of players on the tour who struggled mentally, and I just didn't have the skills to help them. at the end of the day, they had great technical skills, great physical skills. They understood the tactical areas of the game, but they still couldn't successfully compete or reach their potential. And so then that's when I decided, I really want to specialize in the psych aspects of the game to basically help players to take best advantage of all the other skills that we tend to spend so much time working on improving.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you do see, that's the thing that always surprises me, is that, it's quite a well-known saying, I guess, that sport's 90% mental, or, whatever the percentage is, it's high. Yet when you look at the way people train, they spend 99.9% of their time on developing physical attributes or on-court training or playing matches, but very little time on the psychology. And so obviously you found major benefit in focusing on that aspect. Not all players have spent, time with a sports psychologist, but yeah, sounds like you obviously really made it work for you as a player. And then by the sound of it, sounds like you really were able to help some really talented professional players as well. So
absolutely, super important.
Yeah, definitely, man. And just to shift gears a little bit, it's something that I think is really relevant to the listeners in terms of, I guess, your own mental toughness. I guess when I first started to chat with you a couple of years ago, I think it was about 3 years ago, I couldn't actually talk with you on the phone. We were doing everything via email, and the reason for that is obviously you had a significant illness. I think it'd be good for the listeners to, I guess, to hear a little bit of the background on that, because what sort of fascinates me with that is that, you were essentially unable to really, do the basics, but you found a way, you fought through it. Here you are today, and you're still going and building a successful business and helping other people. So, do you want to go into a little bit of a background on that, mate, and what you've been through the last couple of years and how you applied the psychology to sort of get out of it?
Yeah, well, the name of the illness has been called the metabolic trap. And so basically this has been researched at Stanford, where they believe what happens is that your system basically stops metabolizing food, and your body goes into a sort of starvation response. And then once that happens, different systems in your body start failing. And in my case, the main symptoms I had were, and the major symptom was that I got muscle atrophy. So my muscles just started atrophying through my body to like a catastrophic level. So basically at first I couldn't stand. I was in a wheelchair, and things just got worse and worse, to the point where I actually was unable to get out of bed, and I actually couldn't talk for at one stage 18 months. So as you say, when we started to communicate, I was still at the point where I couldn't talk. So I had to do all communications through text and so forth, and other symptoms, like my blood lost the ability to pump against gravity. So I had to be lying the whole time. When you're in that place where you can only lie down and you can't talk, it's taking the lockdown to another level. So it was like a crazy, obviously incredibly challenging experience. And I must say that my experience in tennis, first of all, I think that's the first thing, is I think the sort of the discipline that you learn from playing tennis and working at things and trying to improve your skills, that thing where you got to go out every day and just keep working hard to get a tiny bit better, that was really relevant for me, because I would sometimes, I actually had periods where I couldn't talk, and I'd start to be able to talk again, but I'd do a bit too much and then I wouldn't be able to talk again. And sort of just this day by day, like maybe I can say 2 words or 3 words or whatever it was. So that just discipline that we learned from tennis, I think that was a basic one. In terms of specifics, I absolutely tried to apply the things that I work on with players, and all sorts of things like mindfulness, attention training, lots of visualization. So I visualize myself being healthy again and being able to walk and run and do all those things I wanted to be able to do again. Even you're responding to all the difficult emotions and all the difficult internal experience that came with being in that state and the confusion and sometimes, just the basic frustrations and how difficult it was. So that was a huge part where I basically tried to apply the same skills, that I work on with players and people in everyday life.
Yeah, no, I just find it, obviously very inspiring that only 2 or 3 years ago, you couldn't walk, you couldn't talk and all that kind of stuff. And you've just really bounced back. You kept your business alive over that time, which is amazing as well. So it's an incredible effort. You're working with Pat Flynn, obviously you're offsider there. Just thought it was really relevant in terms of, that there wouldn't be any tougher adversity that someone goes through than that. And you've obviously come out the other side. And I like your analogy with the lockdown. It's about the most extreme lockdown that you can possibly go into, mate. So no, real credit to you, mate, for coming out the other side there and that, mate. So just moving on there, I think that was important for people to understand where you've come from. The other thing is your PhD in tennis parenting, and the fact that you spent a lot of time interviewing players and parents and professionals and all that. Do you want to maybe go into a little bit about why you studied that, and then what what's relevant to parents, and what did you find out of that?
Yeah. So when I went into psychology and I started working with Tennis Australia, so I was basically the first psychologist with Tennis Australia when they started putting together the national academies, that I was working really extensively in Queensland. And one of the things that I learned pretty quickly was the importance of parents, like the influence of parents in how mentally tough players tend to become over time. And so I first did my master's thesis on that, where I researched and I interviewed lots of players who won like Grand Slams versus players who maybe weren't so successful, their parents, coaches of Grand Slam players. And at the end of that study, that research was really based on what is the important factors of mental toughness. And at the end of that research, the findings were that parents were the most important factor of all, more important than coaches, more important than player personalities and natural characteristics, which I found fascinating. And it sort of linked with what I was experiencing in terms of the players, the young players that were coming through in the National Academy where I was working in Brisbane. And then I decided to go and do my PhD with Tennis Australia. We did a collaboration where I used what's called self-determination theory, which is basically the most well-researched motivational theory in the world in terms of academics and basically sport, work performance, and so forth. And self-determination theory has basically three main core tenets, which have been found over and over in research to be core to how people come to thrive and the influences on that. And so with the PhD, I did a parent workshop series with Tennis Australia, where I developed a workshop series based on self-determination theory and working specifically with parents. And the interesting thing was in that research, what we found was that I never met the kids. I never met the players at all. I only did workshops with the parents. And during that time, we were actually able to show that the players' responses in matches actually improved without me ever meeting them, just purely by doing these workshops and working with parents around the ideas of self-determination theory and their own communications with their kids. So like Ash Barty's parents were part of that, a lot of John Millman's parents. It was like a really interesting study. Lots of Jason Kubler, who's gone top 100, his mum was part of that as well. So really interesting work.
I think it's fascinating that I hadn't heard you talk about that before, the fact that you just work with parents and the kids got tougher and their results got better. That's a really, really interesting thing. I mean, we know that parents play the biggest influence out of any person in terms of their child's tennis career. But do you want to maybe go through, I guess, what are the fundamental things that actually, in that case study there you're talking about, where players improved as a result of your interaction or your coaching of parents? What were some of the key coaching points that had that influence on the players or the parents' children?
Yeah, so there was different parts of the workshop series that we focused. We basically focused on four main parts, like why are parents important? So this is basically looking at, we actually went into the brain development of children and explained and looked at the research around why parents are so important in influencing kids' development, and that helps to motivate parents to try to act in line with these communications. We looked at what to do, obviously. We looked at the challenges. So we looked at why is it so challenging for parents, and help parents to understand why is it so emotional, and why is it so sometimes really challenging to communicate in a way that perhaps we would like to. And then we also, the thing that we did is we sort of took it where we would do the same thing working with players, where we would teach players skills to respond to emotions. For example, we would teach parents, we would typically teach players skills around being able to concentrate better. And we did the same for parents. So we actually applied the same approach to parents, where we basically sort of saw parents as performers. And when they were watching their children, we taught them the same process, I guess, in terms of trying to be in the present moment, try to respond well to the emotions when they showed up, and taught them mindfulness. We did mindfulness training with parents, because there's a lot of research around, in general, parenting research around if parents can improve their mindfulness skill, which is basically the ability to pay attention to present moment targets and be more accepting of all the things that tend to show up for us as humans. They'll actually develop their skill in being able to make intentional choices in terms of communications and so forth.
Yeah, definitely, mate. And so I guess just touching on what you're talking about there, which is around, I guess, parents handling their emotions on the court. So when their child's playing, because I've read some of your studies as well that you produced in your work, and you talk about, how parents' emotions basically mirror their child's emotions when they're in the middle of matches. And it's often even harder as a parent to deal with those emotions, because at least the player can take action on the court and fight harder or change strategies or whatever it is. But a parent is actually helpless. They actually have to sit there, watch the match. They can't do anything about it, and they're experiencing all these intense emotions. And you talk about, I guess, what effect does it have on a player when they see, or a child, when they see their parent, displaying lots of emotions in the grandstand, or, while courtside? Like, does it, has a negative effect on them? And why should parents try and control that?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really key point. What you're talking about there is, from a brain perspective, we talk about mirror neurons, and these are the neurons in our brain where, when we are observing someone do something, or when we're seeing and connecting with someone feeling emotions, we tend to feel the same things. And obviously, with the parent-child bond, the attachment between parents and children, this is like amplified at a massive effect. And so the effect is that I think one main thing there, it's important to stress, sometimes parents think it's just basically what I say is the communications, but most communications amongst us all comes from non-verbal communications. And even more than that, our emotions themselves, how we're feeling, tend to shape others. And so in terms of how parents feel, their own experience, and obviously, how they're reacting non-verbally, that has a massive effect on children's own experience and how they come to see themselves, and how they come to sort of relate to tennis. Like, how do they come to see tennis, and what's important to them about tennis? That's really heavily influenced by parent communications, which include these non-verbals.
Yeah, and what parents value, and I guess if a player, and we see this a little bit, and unfortunately in some scenarios, I guess parents showing love towards their child conditionally when they win, and when they lose, then they sort of turn the love tap off, and are disappointed. And so what you're saying there is like communications like that can have quite a big psychological impact on the child. And using
Yeah.
that as an example, what are the impacts of sort of conditional love to a child, tennis parent relationship?
Yeah. So that what you're talking about there is what we basically found as the most important.
I think we've lost Ross.
We lost Rossi. Okay, I'll just see whether he's. Sorry, guys. Hopefully Rossi will be back in a moment there. See whether his line just might have dropped out. Guys, if you just give me 30 seconds. All right, I'm just working on the moment of trying to get Rossi back on the line. Really interesting conversation there, just in terms of the role, I guess, and the importance that parents can play. And I know in terms of when we put together our book, Winning on and Off the Court, the chapter on psychology was hugely influenced by a lot of Anthony's input in terms of how big an impact, I guess, parents have, and then all the other psychological foundations that are.
I'm back.
Are you back, mate?
Hi, mate. I'm back.
Okay.
I'm back.
All right, mate. I'm not sure what happened. I'm not sure what happened there, mate. But you were just talking about the impact of conditional love.
Yeah, the conditional. Yeah. So basically the idea here is that if parents and coaches, it's the same for all of us, if we communicate with this idea of conditional positive regard. So what tends to happen is it actually adds the pressure of competing. So if kids think, sort of my parents' regard of me is on the line when they compete, they're going to feel a lot more pressure, a lot more fear about losing, a lot more pain when they lose. And what tends to happen over time in these circumstances is that children then, they tend to develop habits or defenses to this level of fear and pain that they feel. So common scenarios are that players will more often start giving up, not trying as hard. They'll tend to have more anger. They'll tend to basically use different behaviors without really recognizing what's happening to lessen the fear of failure and lessen the pain that they lose, pain that they feel when they lose due to this sense that they get from parent communications.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, definitely see that a lot. And having spent a little bit of time with Ash Barty's dad, quite recently as well, had a few really good conversations with him. I mean, when you just talk with someone like Rob, you get this real sense of that it's just all about just being a parent. He's probably the least sort of engaged parent I think I've come across as far as riding the highs and lows of Ash's tennis. He just, she comes off the court and he loves her regardless. And I think you can see with someone like Ash that she plays without any weight on her shoulders when she plays. You can see she's probably one of the most free players, and I guess the parent, the parents have had a huge impact on that from what I can see.
They're a really good example. They're a really good example.
Absolutely. So
yeah.
And so I guess we talked about two things there. One is just parents being able to manage their emotions while their children play matches. The idea of providing, unconditional love for their child, so they can build, I guess, their confidence and self-esteem and not have it relate to winning or losing. Are there any other sort of, without going, we don't have a huge amount of time, any other sort of core principles or things that you think parents can do to help, build, psychologically really healthy children?
Yeah. So probably the main one I would say is around that idea of competence, that second C. So things we'd look at or encourage parents to do here are to do things like actually set high expectations, right? So if parents can communicate around their belief in the child to achieve things that they want and to become successful, then that's a great thing, because over time children will tend to take on that perspective of self-belief. That's an example. Another great thing to do around competence is to try to have the bias of focusing on what children do well more so than what they don't do well. So that, I think that's a real common one, and it's a habit that I certainly had to work on myself as a coach, where we tend to want to focus on in trying to help players to improve, to say, okay, this is what you did wrong, this is what you got to do better at. But in fact, that tends to lead to children having a bias towards focusing on what they're doing wrong. And what we really want is for players to develop this self-belief and confidence through this sense of more communications around what they're doing well. Another important one on this is the idea of normalizing these difficult emotions that come with competing. That's a real common mistake, once again, that coaches and parents tend to make. Traditionally, we've had this idea that we should be controlling our emotions, and that feeling nervous and anxious and feeling frustration are things that we should try to reduce and control. But unfortunately, because it's such a natural part of competing, what we really want to do, what's most helpful for players over time, is when we normalize these experiences and allow players and allow children to recognize that it's normal, that everyone feels these things. If we talk to the best players in the world, they would say the same things, that they're struggling with difficult emotions and outcome thoughts and worrying about losing and all that same stuff that the audience's children would be feeling as well.
Yeah, I find that I know when we first started working together, I found that approach really interesting and actually really refreshing, because there is the other approach which you do hear about, which is, yeah, as you say, control the emotions, or like you've sort of got people like Tony Robbins who are very much, change your state if you're not in a good state. But I always found that as a player, that's just incredibly hard to do. Once you sort of experience some sort of adversity and you find yourself getting frustrated or angry, it's really, really hard to control that or suppress it, which is what we see a lot. But I think from what I can see there as well, is just being able to learn to play through those difficult emotions and the difficult feelings, and almost practice that is a far better approach. And that's what you really see at the highest level. You still see even Andy Murray a couple of years ago, quite a frustrated sort of player a lot of the time, but he doesn't drop his level. His level stays incredibly high. Djokovic, you see, have his explosions, and then really high profile, I guess, probably the highest profile player that used to do it was someone like McEnroe, who was constantly exploding, but was famous for getting angry and then serving aces immediately after, So, it's a really, really interesting approach that I think is really beneficial from what I've seen from all our players as well. That you don't have to control your emotions. You just have to learn to play and perform at a high level with all of these good and bad emotions that are happening all the time. So no, it's a really, really good point there. And maybe just as a final thing before we go into Q&A in a moment, just around any suggestions that you might have for either parents or players on what they could do during a lockdown at the moment in Singapore. So at the moment everyone's more or less sort of housebound. Is there anything that parents could do to help their children, or just players in general to help improve their psychology?
I mean, there really is. We could probably spend an hour or so on this one. We actually just finished what we call a 28-day challenge, where we just set little challenges that were done every day on the mental sides of the game. And the things we focused on were some of the things I've mentioned: attention, strength training. So practicing, being able to develop fitness and being able to aim and maintain attention on certain targets, which is so key for tennis. Did a lot of visualization. So that's a helpful skill. Actually, with visualization, we can actually practice improving skills simply through visualization. That's been proven in research. Just doing little simple activities, like a simple activity that players can do is something like bouncing the ball on the side of their racket, for example, and see how good they can become at that. But start to treat that like a tennis point where they focus on a process that they think is going to be helpful to improve that. Notice when their attention wanders, or maybe set themselves a target and notice when they start getting frustrated. See if they can notice that feeling in their body and then come back to that process. So maybe it's like having a loose grip, or maybe it's watching the ball, the simple processes. So you can actually practice the same competitive process that's helpful in such a simple activity as that. So there are 3 really good examples of what players can definitely do to not only get through the lockdown, but actually improve their skills.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's some really really good points there, mate. And I think it's about time now. Yeah, it's about half an hour in. Why don't we now open it up now to Q&A? So yeah, if parents have any questions at the moment, we're just opening up the questions box. So feel free to write in any questions that you might have, and go from there. So just looking at the one of the first questions there at the moment. I don't know whether you can see that, Rossi, but yeah, communication is always key. What factors would determine as good skills for parents to hone and then impart with their children? I guess, yeah, what are some good skills for parents to impart on their children?
So if we're talking about the skills that apply to performance, I guess, in any area, that one I was just talking about. So a simple skill, which is great for both parents, but also for kids as well, is what I would call attention strength training. So with attention strength training, all we are doing is we're picking a target in the present moment. So it could be as simple as noticing the sounds around us, or noticing our breath, or noticing a sensation in our body. And what we do is we try to just practice aiming and maintaining our attention on that target that we've chosen. And then the second part of improving the skill is to recognize as quickly as possible when we're no longer paying attention to that target. So usually what happens very quickly is we'll notice that our mind has wandered onto it's gone somewhere else, or we've perhaps can become caught up in other thoughts. And particularly when we do this type of activity, our mind will tend to comment like, oh, this is boring, or I'm not very good at this. And this is the sort of thing we're talking about. If we can notice that when that happens, and then just draw our attention back into the present, then that is an awesome skill. It's so important for all of us in basically, all arenas, but especially for players on the court. It helps develop concentration, which is key. But when we notice that our mind has wandered, and if we can see what's happened, why am I no longer paying attention to my breath, if that's what I've chosen, then in that moment we develop our self-awareness. And if we're having the difficult thoughts or feelings, if we can just sit with that for a few seconds, that's a great thing to practice before we return our attention. So yeah, that's one that would be the most basic skill that I would encourage people to practice. And on the court, players can do that when they do get back on court. But as soon as they start hitting, just pick a simple target to pay attention to. Notice when you recognize that your mind has wandered somewhere else, and then just bring it back to the target.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, that ability to be able to sustain concentration for long periods is such a huge skill. And I guess I noticed that when I first started playing on the professional circuit, and a lot of the players that were the best there that I played against on the circuit were actually not necessarily the best strikers of the ball or the best tactical players, but they just had this ability to play every single point at a very good level, and without sort of any lapses of concentration for long periods. So, I also found it really interesting. Like when I was like 18, I got to practice a bit with Leighton Hewitt, and he was the world number one at the time. He was, I think he would have been 21 or 22 years old at the time. And he was a classic example of that, where where he was, not necessarily an amazing hitter of the ball. There were plenty of players that were bigger, but he just never lost concentration over really, really long periods of time. So it's a really, really good one, mate. And then it looks like we've got another question come through here. This is a really common one that you'd find this question all over the world, which is how can we encourage kids to hit through and not tighten up during matches? So that's probably a classic one in terms of, your child might play great in practice, and then when they get to the match, they tighten up. And what suggestions do you have around that?
Yeah, that might be the most common question I get, the most common thing I work on with players. And what's really happening there is naturally when we go into competition as compared to practice, our brain sort of interprets competition as sort of a life and death battle. And so we naturally feel more anxiety is really the emotion that we feel. And that has that effect on our body where we naturally, our muscles tend to tighten and so forth, and our mind tends to race. And so what we've started talking about tonight is really one of the main things to do. Well, first of all, is to normalize that experience. Okay, so it's really common that players, if I talk to a player, nearly everyone thinks they get tighter than other players, and they're affected by this more than other players, and perhaps it's a problem that they experience nerves and the tightening of their body and so forth. And so first thing is just by normalizing that experience and helping players understand that this is a challenge that everyone has. Even Federer, we're talking about big time matches. Federer against Djokovic in the Wimbledon final last year when he had those match points, and he tightened up basically and didn't hit out on one of those match points, and Djokovic had the easy passing shot. And so basically what we do is we start to practice activities that help to allow players to respond better to the anxiety and to that tightening of the body. So for example, one example, we call it notice look. And so what we get players to do is between points, when they start feeling tight and they start to get the difficult thoughts and the worry thoughts, we actually get them to observe the physical sensations in their body, like they could observe, say, the physical discomfort they get when they're running. They'd be able to notice that in their body. And so what we teach is for them to observe the sense, and they would actually be able to find the tightness in their body and try to look at that, really just observe it in their body, and just basically report. And instead of trying to get rid of it or change it, what we find is when players can observe it almost like curiously, like if you're trying to really look at it, it's a weird thing to do, and notice the nerves, you tend to get less caught up in it. So when players are getting tight and they're choking, they're really caught up in the nerves. But as soon as we sit back almost and we can see the sensations in our body, that it tends to loosen it up, and we have more choice in how we respond to the nerves and to that experience. So that's a real basic one, but a good one to keep in mind as a bit of a starting point on that.
Yeah, definitely, mate. And one of the most notable sort of matches that I think about is and watched recently with some of the active SG team as well was the Goran Ivanisevic Pat Rafter Wimbledon final.
Oh yeah,
it was a classic example of that, where it went to 5 sets. Ivanisevic had made the final of Wimbledon twice. He was serving for the match. I think he won probably 99% of service games that tournament. And he went to serve it out, and I think he double faulted 4 times. He shanked volleys. I mean, everything was going on. And then in the post-match interview, I think I remember hearing him say that his arm felt like it was like 50 kilos or something,
Yeah.
And is that actually, I mean, I guess the mind or the human brain can make all those things happen, right? And they if he feels like his arm feels like it's 50 kilos, it probably is. I mean, how does that work? How can the brain make your body think all those things when all he had to do was hold serve another time, like he'd done 99 times out of 100?
Yeah. Our brain, when we're competing, funnily enough, it basically misinterprets what's happening, and it interprets those sort of situations as like we're sort of in a life and death battle, or like we're in great danger, even though in reality we're not. And then part of our human response when we feel that fear So it's basically the fear response is our body can like fight. So sometimes you'll get the fight, but part of that, the way that our body tends to react is a freeze response. It's called the freeze response. So it's basically our brain's fear response is can freeze, and people, researchers and experts think that's part of that is if we were in a dangerous situation throughout history, if we were able to freeze and sort of hide, that increased our chance of surviving. And so now that's been built into our system. And so when we get to these really high pressure moments of trying to finish close matches would probably be the most common one, or even starting matches when we're unsure about what's going to happen. These two situations tend to naturally lead to this fear response in our body, and it's a freeze. Our body tends to have at least a degree of freezing, and that's the tightening and the heaviness and so forth, the eye and arm.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a really interesting point there around that. And I think like when you I've read part of your book as well, which sort of talks about when people get into a winning position, and they're up 6-love, 3-love, or 4-love, or they've got a match point. I mean, that's actually, we often see performance drop significantly at that moment. And from what I mean, maybe you can sort of elaborate on why that happens. Why don't people just, because there's a lot at stake, isn't there, when you're winning a match and then you lose it. And it's not just about winning or losing, it's about what your peers might think after that. It's like, what are people going to say? You had match points and you lost. Can you maybe talk through why being ahead on the scoreboard, all these fear responses start coming up with players?
Yeah, it's a weird one. It doesn't really make sense when you first think about it, right? Because you're in front and you're further away from losing than at any other time. So it particularly happens when we're ahead, but there's still a possibility that we will lose. And so most commonly it's as we near the finish line, but there's the possibility that the other player could still come back. And the reason it happens is probably because, if I was playing you and you had much better skills than me and you were a better player and you beat me comfortably and I lost, that I could sort of blame my skill, right? It was like something to do with my skill. I just wasn't good enough. But when we're ahead, we are good enough, right? We've proven that we have the ability to win. And so therefore it actually becomes more dangerous from our brain's perspective, because if we were to lose from a winning position, it sort of shows a personal flaw in me that I was good enough to win, but I actually couldn't get it done. And so that's the most common explanation that makes a lot of sense to me, that you hear, that it's actually psychologically, weirdly, the most dangerous time from our brain's perspective is when we're trying to finish a match because we've shown we can win, but then if we actually lose from there, then it's not about our sports skill. It's something to do with me personally, and that I just couldn't get the job done.
Yeah, and I can just relate to that in terms of like the most painful losses I ever had were, as a player. It wasn't the 6-1, 6-1s where you get outclassed. It was the matches where you had match points. I can remember probably 4 or 5 in my whole career where I had match points and lost, and the pain that you feel from that is maybe 10 times greater than someone just totally outplaying you. So, yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I guess from a parent's perspective, it's just probably really good for parents to understand that, that if their child does get ahead on the scoreboard, they get up in a winning position and they lose, their child's probably going to be going through a lot of pain, emotional pain for those types of losses, and probably just to be there from a parent's point of view to support and provide that. That's
and it's also a very good one for parents to understand this idea that children will naturally feel a lot of fear and nervousness around these situations, because it's a hard one initially to wrap our head around. And so I see that a lot with parents sort of, communicating to children, say, look, just don't think of the outcome. Why have you got something to feel nervous about there? And that's where we talk about this normalizing. It's if parents can understand that their child's experience and have that empathy for what they're going through, they're likely to be a lot or communicate a lot more successfully.
Yeah, definitely, mate. All right. Well, I think we've actually hit the time there now. So yeah, just wanted to say, mate, thank you very much for coming on the call, mate. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And if parents want to find out a little bit more about how you help parents or players, I mean, how can they find out more?
So the easiest way is just to go to mentallytoughtennis.com, which is my website. And on that, the main page there, they can contact me directly through my email or the other thing I would suggest is if they're interested in seeing my basic approach for players in developing mental toughness, then they can download what's called the PACT method workbook. And the last thing I would suggest is if they click on the families link or the parents link, we've also got a parent booklet which goes in detail into the parents' role and what parents can do as well, which is pretty relevant to today's conversation.
Yeah, definitely, mate. Well, and thanks again, Rossi. I really appreciate it, mate. And just for the parents on the call, so next week again we've got another webinar coming up at 6 o'clock. Again, we're just locking in the speaker. We've got sort of a couple of choices there that we're deciding whether to go next week or the week after. But yeah, tune in. We'll send out those details on Monday next week with the next session. And once again, thanks for joining the call to the listeners and to Anthony for coming on, mate. Thanks again, and look forward to talking with you guys again next week.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.